It turns out that the foods that I eat in a day are eerily similar to what the ancient Aztecs would eat. And what's kind of interesting is that even though the ancient Aztecs didn't have a long life expectancy for pretty obvious reasons, because there was a lot of fighting, a lot of disease, their diet is also eerily similar to the Nicoyan Peninsula, which is a blue zone, which has a huge concentration of centenarians. Now, the Nicoyan Peninsula in Costa Rica is still very different from Mexico and where the ancient Aztecs were, but still a lot of similarities, which we're going to talk about. But the funny thing is as I was doing research on what the ancient Aztecs ate, I'm realizing like, wow, most of these are foods that I eat on a regular basis. So is my diet did we just like stumble across the new fad diet of like the Aztec diet? It's kind of interesting because these foods are exceptionally nutrient dense. So let's kind of go into it. It's kind of interesting. One of the first foods that they would eat a lot of, which is interesting, but also no surprise, is chocolate. And if you followed me for a while, you know I'm a huge dark chocolate fan. What's kind of interesting though is that both the Aztecs and the Mayans would consume chocolate, but they would consume it in different ways. So for example, like the Aztecs would typically make more of a sweeter drink with like honey and vanilla and kind of make a beverage that way, whereas the Mayans were known for making more complex drinks. And you can kind of see that in some of the older kind of documentation. They were like concoctions, right? Still kind of interesting either way. But the cool thing is there was a relatively new study, I think it was a 2024 study, looked at 21,000 people that consumed chocolate or didn't consume chocolate. Those that consumed dark chocolate had a 25% less likelihood of premature death than those that didn't consume chocolate. So yes, even though there are high amounts of anti-nutrients in chocolate, the bioactive flavonoids, the prebiotic effect of it, it's hugely beneficial. Like chocolate has been a staple for me for a very long time. Number two, this is kind of funny because a lot of this also coincides with some of Paul Saladino's favorite foods too, which, you know, think what you want about him. The guy looks great and he makes some good points on some stuff, right? Honey, right? So the Aztecs and the Mayans both were big with honey, but the Aztecs in particular, they were known for like using it as a sweetener. It's kind of interesting because that's exactly how I use honey. I do take spoonfuls of it now and then, but a lot of times I'll just sweeten stuff with it, which doesn't require a lot of it. So it's interesting that they would make chocolate beverages and use honey. So far we've got two things that I definitely eat a bunch of. The third thing that the ancient Aztecs would eat a lot of was deer. Okay, they would hunt a lot of wild game meat. So obviously, whatever they could probably get their hands on. I wasn't alive then, so I can't tell you. They probably ate insects too. But deer is a pretty big deal. That is something that's going to be a very lean red meat. And if you look at my diet, wow. If you go back on my videos, you'll see that I'm always a fan of venison whenever possible. And I really prefer lean cuts of red meat. I prefer lean ground beef, like 96% lean. Whenever I can get my hands on lean venison, that's what I'll eat. Because I'm getting all the benefits of the red meat, from the B vitamins, from the just multivitamin-like effect, but I'm getting it without the additional caloric intake that I may or may not want. So in this particular case, kind of interesting to see this. Now next up is turkey, which is interesting because I've known this for a little while, that like turkey was one of the first domesticated foods for Mexico, for the Aztecs. So they definitely consumed a lot of turkey. This is where we differ. I think that ground turkey tastes like wet dog a little bit. Like, you know how a wet dog smells? I've talked about this. Like ground turkey just has that taste, that smell. And I mean, full disclaimer, I guess the Aztecs, I guess they did actually consume dog too. So that's something we're gonna kind of stay off the list, but I'm more of a fan of the ground chicken personally. So like I go for ground chicken, I go for chicken breast. Fun fact though, when I was just filming with Bill Maeda out in Hawaii, he tells me, do you eat much chicken? He goes, I don't eat chicken, it's a weak bird. I'm like, oh shoot, I guess maybe I should switch to turkey. Okay, anyway, point is, interesting. The next thing that they eat, which I actually do consume, is going to be a form of maize. Now, maize is like corn that's been mashed into a maize to make like a chip or whatever, right? But they would go through an interesting process. They would make it into something called nixtamalized corn or nixtamalized maize. So it would go through what is called a nixtamalization process, where they would soak it. Now, they weren't probably doing this for health reasons. Maybe they were doing it just because it would actually get some of the stuff out of it and allow it to be more malleable and workable. But when you soak it, and modernly it's soaked in like an alkaline solution, you end up getting rid of some of the mycotoxins, you get rid of some of the other components of it that aren't so clean. It makes it just easier to digest. But then they'd of course make tortillas, they'd make chips, whatever, which is pretty interesting because when you look at corn as a whole, like corn as a vegetable or whatever the heck you want to call it, it's really not that problematic. It's just like, what are we consuming nowadays? Like, what is the corn that we consume? And we're certainly not consuming it in a nixtamalized fashion, right? I don't know if you've heard of that company called Masa before, but Masa is a company that's making corn chips from nixtamalized maize, like they're taking real maize and they're soaking it this way, like the ancient Aztecs did, and then they are cooking it in beef tallow, and then just adding salt, Redmond real salt. So it's 3 ingredients: nixtamalized corn, beef tallow, and salt. These things are like that thick. They're like legit, they're like a food, not just a snack or a salsa or guacamole delivery system. They're actually something that has substance to them. They have a crunch to them. There's no seed oils or anything like that. Yes, they are a sponsor on this channel, on this video. I would highly recommend you check them out. I put a link down below for a special link, a special price on those Masa chips. If you're into it, they also have a company called Vandy, which does the same thing with potatoes. Like they have potatoes, tallow, and salt to make like a real potato crisp. Because I think when we get down to the nuance of it, like it's the processing and the stuff that we add to it and probably the abundance of oxidized oils that are the problem. So when you cook in tallow, it's stable. This is a different ballgame. This is eating it as close to how the Aztecs would have eaten it. And if you like chips, but you don't like the seed oils and you don't like the garbage that's in them, give these a try. You still don't want to eat bags and bags of them. Like, of course, they still are food and you want to treat them like, I don't know, any other food where you don't go overboard. But the nice thing is, because it's real food, you can kind of control the appetite a little bit more with them. Anyhow, that link is down below. You got to try them out. The next thing that they would eat are beans. Now, that's no surprise, black beans, right? A lot of that. But that's where we're similar with the Nicoyan Peninsula in Costa Rica. In Costa Rica, they would eat the maize, they would eat the corn, they would eat squash, they would eat these things. So again, we're talking about high protein foods here, that even though they're not meat, in conjunction with their meat intake, that's a pretty high protein diet, which leads us into what they would call the 3 sisters, right? So the Aztecs would call it the 3 sisters because it was the maize, it was the beans, and it was the squash. So pumpkins, all kinds of different squashes. And you look at it and you're like magically creating this complete protein profile. So they're getting deer meat, venison, and then they're also getting a complete protein from the plant sources that they're getting it from. That's a pretty high protein diet. I am a huge fan of squash. And again, if you've watched my videos, like butternut squash is on my list all the time. Low glycemic, high fiber, high beta carotene, other carotenoids. We're talking like an antioxidant rich food that is pretty darn low calorie, that is a tremendous source of carbs without going overboard. And then of course they consumed a lot of fish. But because it was interior, there was probably a lot of lake fish consumption, which that probably wasn't a big problem back then, but nowadays, like I do try to get lake fish if I can. I love rainbow trout, I love other forms of bass, and the thing is, oceans are potentially contaminated. So yeah, you do have a degree of that garbage that's in there. So lake fish is safer in that degree. So whenever I can get my hands on it, that is the route that I'll go. So once again, we have another food that they eat that kind of falls in line with my diet. I'm starting to think that maybe this is the diet that I follow for the most part. Let's keep going. And then we get into chia. So chia was another food that was big for the ancient Aztecs. Wild, because if you've watched my channel, I've talked about flax and chia as staples for me. I firmly believe that getting soluble fiber in is a bigger lever that you can pull rather than, say, eating a bunch of vegetables to get fiber in. Eating a bunch of roughage, a bunch of stuff, that's really not getting you a ton of nutrients just to get fiber when you could have a couple tablespoons of chia. So they would make literal puddings out of it, just like we do today. They would use it as a topping. They would cook with it. So it's interesting to see that. It's one of the most nutrient-dense, like soluble fibers that you can get. Don't make any mistakes thinking that like you're gonna get a high amount of omega-3s from chia seeds. The ALA, alpha-linoleic acid, like the conversion process is ridiculous and you barely get anything in the way of omega-3 from any kind of land source. So just don't buy into that. Number 9, this is one that I don't consume a lot of because modern day, it's not that great. But back then it was probably different. agave. So we weren't just talking straight agave syrup as a sweetener, we're talking like the full thing. We're talking about the entire plant, we're talking about the pulp and the fibers, and mashing it together and actually making it into like a sweet sort of mash that you could eat. I'm sure they used it as a sweetener too. Remember, I wasn't alive then, okay? And I don't think agave is heavily used in the Nicoyan Peninsula Blue Zone as well. So I know I'm trying to triangulate between the Aztecs, my diet, and the Nicoyan Peninsula in Costa Rica. So I can't say for sure if the Nicoyans consumed this or did, but either way, the amount of fiber and the amount of just overall nutritional value you're probably getting from agave in that form, that might be something I want to add into my diet. The next thing is another thing that's kind of weird that I don't have in my diet. I have had it before, but I don't have it regularly, and that's prickly pear. So again, you have something that's very nutrient dense considering the caloric value of it. So is it something you want to add to your diet all the time? And if you're trying to get more fiber in, but again, easy to cook with, easy to add structure to things with it. Another one of these sort of pseudo cereals or pseudo grains that they would consume is something that's making a really big comeback right now. It's called amaranth. You're seeing a lot more like amaranth flake cereals or amaranth, different kinds of breads that have amaranth. So it's a pseudo cereal or a pseudo grain. So it technically doesn't have gluten. It's more like in the ballpark of, say, quinoa, where it's technically not a grain, but it kind of acts like a grain, but it's not. It's about 20% protein just by weight. So in the world of grains, it's a very low glycemic, really good quality grain with really high mineralization, high mineral content, and micronutrient content, super high in calcium and iron specifically. So again, you're looking at, okay, not stripped, like nutrientless refined rice. You're talking about grains and something that really just doesn't have a lot of gluten. Their diet just, where's the gluten? Like they didn't have wheat, like show me the gluten. They had amaranth, they had maize, they had beans, they had squash, and they would make tortillas, but they weren't making them with wheat. And then lastly, a fair bit of tomatoes, which tomatoes aren't in my diet unless they're cooked. I'm not a huge tomato fan, so this one doesn't necessarily align with me. But another thing that's kind of interesting is if you look at like the Nicoyans and you look at some of the evidence with the Aztecs, we don't really know entirely. The Nicoyans celebrate food, but they celebrate food a lot of times with big breakfasts, which is strategically and scientifically seems to be really good, right? Because you're allocating calories in the morning and it actually allows for better circadian cues and better sleep. So bigger breakfast, smaller lunch, sometimes really small dinners. It seems based on the literature that like food was really celebrated in Aztec and Mayan culture. So much to the point where there were some things that wouldn't exactly be okay in today's world, but there was a lot of things about the Aztecs that wouldn't be okay in today's world, and that's just fine. But the way that they would celebrate food, it was almost as though they would go long periods of time without food and then celebratory acts with the food, right? So it sounds like, okay, if I were to eat this today, I'd just be going to Taco Bell all the time. The reality is though this is like as wholesome as it gets. And then of course, there's one other thing we have to add into the mix, avocados. Avocados being one of the best sources of monounsaturated fats that you could possibly get. So we talk about the Mediterranean region having olive oil. If you were to eat closer to how the Aztecs would eat, you're almost adopting a Mediterranean lifestyle, sunlight, all this stuff, except instead of having pastas and grains, you're having amaranth and maize. It's pretty darn awesome. So keep it locked in here on my channel, and also don't forget to check out masa chips down below in the top line of the description.